The morning air hung thick over landing zone X-ray. November 14, 1965. 10:48 a.m. First Lieutenant James Riley's hands wouldn't stop shaking. He tried to write in his field notebook, but the pen kept slipping between his fingers. Around him, the elephant grass stood silent. Above, the rotor wash from departing Hueys still echoed through the valley. His rifle had just saved his life. But 3 men beside him were dead. Their rifles had refused to fire. 14 miles west of Plai Mi Camp, deep in the central highlands of South Vietnam, something was terribly wrong. The soldiers of the 1st Cavalry Division, America's elite airmobile force, had just landed in the Ia Drang Valley. They'd come down at the base of the Chu Pang Massif, where the jungle pressed against the Cambodian border like a wall of green darkness. 450 men under Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore. Within minutes of touching ground, they'd met the North Vietnamese army. What would unfold over the next 72 hours would become legend. But hidden inside that legend was a darker story. A mechanical failure so catastrophic, so preventable, that it would eventually force Congress to intervene. Men were dying. Not from enemy bullets. From rifles that betrayed them. The weapon in Riley's hands, the M-16, had been promised as revolutionary. Lightweight. Devastating firepower. The future of infantry combat. For some soldiers that morning, it delivered everything advertised. For others, it jammed after 5 rounds. And in jungle warfare, 5 rounds isn't enough to stay alive. What none of these men knew, not Riley with his trembling hands, not Moore coordinating his companies, not the door gunners watching them descend into hell, was that this moment marked the beginning of one of the worst equipment disasters in American military history. The mathematics of tragedy were already written. Not in tactics or terrain. In powder specifications. Chrome plating decisions. Cost-saving measures that valued budget over blood. The crisis hadn't begun in Vietnam's jungles. It had started in Pentagon conference rooms. In contractor boardrooms. In production facilities where engineers raised red flags that nobody wanted to hear. Because there was a war to fight. And the M-16 needed to be there. Even if it wasn't ready. Underscore 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 underscore. The weapon that would betray American soldiers started its life as something beautiful. The Armalite AR-15. Eugene Stoner designed it in the late 1950s, and when you held it in your hands, you understood immediately that this wasn't like other rifles. Stoner had served as a Marine in the Pacific during World War II. He'd seen combat. He knew what soldiers needed. And he knew what they didn't need was weight. The M14, America's standard battle rifle, weighed 9.2 pounds. Heavy, solid, chambered in 7.62mm NATO. A descendant of the M1 Garand that had won World War II. Traditional. Proven. Loved by the old guard. Stoner's AR-15 weighed 6.37 pounds. Nearly 3 pounds lighter. That difference matters when you're humping through jungle at 100 degrees. When every ounce of weight is another step closer to heat exhaustion. When you're carrying ammunition, water, grenades, radio batteries, and survival gear. But the revolution wasn't just weight. Fort Benning, Georgia. May 1957. The first demonstration. Officers gathered to watch this strange, lightweight rifle fire its small caliber round. 5.56mm. Tiny compared to the 7.62 NATO. Some called it a varmint round, something you'd use for shooting prairie dogs. Then they saw what it did to targets. The bullet left the barrel at over 3,000 feet per second. That velocity created something called hydrostatic shock. When the round hit tissue, it didn't just punch through. It created a temporary wound cavity that collapsed organs, severed blood vessels, and caused devastating trauma. At close range, the ranges where jungle combat happened, it was absolutely lethal. Special Forces units tested the AR-15 in 1962. The reports came back glowing. Light recoil meant soldiers could actually control the weapon in full automatic. The 30-round magazine gave sustained firepower. You could carry 300 rounds of 5.56 for the same weight as 180 rounds of 7.62. Air Force Security Police adopted it. They loved it. Every early test showed the same thing. This rifle was something special. Purpose-built for the kind of war America was about to fight in Southeast Asia. But somewhere between those promising trials and full deployment, something went wrong. Actually, many things went wrong. And each decision that went wrong had a name attached to it. Had a memo. Had a meeting where someone raised concerns and someone else overruled them. January 1963. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara made his decision. The AR-15 was superior to the M-14. Production of the M-14 would halt. In November, he ordered 85,000 of the new rifles, designated M-16E1. The Army brass hated it. They'd grown up with the M-14. With heavy rifles that kicked hard and demanded respect. This lightweight thing with its plastic furniture and small bullet felt like a toy. But McNamara wasn't asking their opinion. He was telling them. Production started in March 1964. But the rifle that rolled off the production line wasn't the rifle that had performed so brilliantly in testing. The changes had already begun. Underscore 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 underscore. The first change seemed minor. Just ammunition. Eugene Stoner had designed the AR-15 around a specific propellant, Ichord 4475, a stick powder manufactured by DuPont. Everything about the weapon was engineered around how that powder burned, how much pressure it generated, how fast it pushed the bullet down the barrel. The AR-15 used something called direct gas impingement. When you fired, some of the propellant gas was tapped off through a port in the barrel. That gas traveled back through a tube directly into the bolt carrier. The pressure drove the carrier backward, ejecting the spent case and chambering a new round. Simple. Elegant. Lightweight. And absolutely dependent on precise gas pressures. March 1964. DuPont delivered bad news. They couldn't mass-produce Ichord 4475 to meet the Army's specifications and timeline. The powder worked perfectly in small batches. But scaling up to millions of rounds while maintaining consistency? Impossible. The extruded stick powder required perfect control of temperature, humidity, cutting processes. Even minor variations affected chamber pressure and velocity. The Army needed millions of rounds. They needed them immediately. DuPont couldn't deliver. Olin Matheson Company stepped forward with a solution. WC-846, a ball propellant already in use for 7.62 NATO ammunition. Ball powder used a completely different manufacturing process. Nitrocellulose dissolved in solvents, formed into tiny spheres, then hardened. Faster production. More consistent. Easier to scale up. A batch of WC-846 took 40 hours compared to 2 weeks for Ichord 4475. Olin could guarantee delivery. The Army said yes. Both the Army and Olin understood that WC-846 burned differently. The ball powder generated higher peak pressures. Maintained those pressures longer as the bullet traveled down the barrel. This meant more gas pressure at the gas port. More propellant gas diverted back into the bolt carrier. More violent action cycling. The cyclic rate jumped from 800 rounds per minute to between 850 and 1,000. But there was something else. Something worse. WC-846 contained calcium carbonate as a stabilizer and deterrent coating. It helped control burn rate. But it left significantly more fouling residue than Ichord 4475. In a traditional rifle with a gas piston system, that fouling went into the piston. You could clean it from outside the action. But the M-16 used direct gas impingement. Every bit of that calcium carbonate residue was blown directly back into the bolt carrier. The bolt. The chamber. With every single shot. Here's what should have happened next. Extensive testing. Thousands of rounds fired. Data collected on malfunction rates, fouling buildup, extraction reliability. Comparison studies between IMR 4475 and WC846 performance. Here's what actually happened. Nothing. The ammunition change was treated as a simple substitution. Army acceptance tests continued using remaining stocks of IMR 4475 ammunition. Meanwhile, millions of rounds of WC846 ammunition were being produced and shipped to Vietnam. Nobody tested the complete system. The rifle had been approved with one type of powder. It was being deployed with another. And nobody thought that might be a problem worth investigating. Underscore 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 underscore. The second decision involved chrome plating. Eugene Stoner and Colt's engineers strongly recommended chrome plating the chamber and bore. This wasn't experimental technology. Chrome plating had been used in artillery barrels since World War I. In aircraft machine guns throughout World War II. The process was straightforward. Electroplate a thin layer of chromium onto the steel's surface. Creates a hard, corrosion-resistant finish. In Vietnam's humidity, chrome plating would protect against corrosion. More importantly, it would help prevent cartridge cases from sticking in the chamber during extraction. The United States military had extensive experience with tropical corrosion. The Pacific Theater in World War II had taught brutal lessons. Weapons that worked perfectly in temperate climates corroded rapidly in the humidity of Pacific Islands. Chrome plating had been identified as the solution decades earlier. The Army rejected the recommendation. Chrome plating added cost. Added production time. Each chamber had to be carefully prepared, plated in an electroplating bath, inspected. Several steps. Several dollars per rifle. There was another concern. Some traditionalists in Army ordnance worried that chrome plating would affect accuracy. Some target shooters believed chrome-plated barrels were less accurate than bare steel. Testing had never confirmed this belief for military-grade accuracy standards. But the belief existed. The decision was made. No chrome plating. The Army cited the expense as cost-prohibitive, though no official documentation specifies the exact savings per rifle. Army ordnance believed that proper maintenance would prevent corrosion problems. In Vietnam's climate and combat conditions, this belief would prove catastrophically wrong. Underscore 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 underscore. The third decision might have been the worst. Colt had advertised the M-16 as requiring minimal maintenance. Far less than the M-14. This was actually true, when firing ammunition loaded with IMR 4475 in controlled conditions. Marketing materials described the rifle as nearly self-cleaning. The Army took this at face value. Soldiers deploying to Vietnam received their new M-16s with virtually no cleaning kits. No instruction on proper maintenance procedures. Often with explicit statements that the rifle required little to no cleaning. Many were told the weapon was self-cleaning, that attempting to clean it improperly might damage it. This guidance would prove lethal when combined with the fouling properties of WC846 powder and the lack of chrome plating. underscore 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 underscore. The fourth modification was symbolic. The original AR-15 lacked a forward assist, a device to manually ram the bolt fully forward if it failed to close on its own. Eugene Stoner had deliberately omitted this feature. His reasoning was simple. If the bolt won't close easily, something is wrong. Clear the malfunction. Don't force it. Army ordnance insisted on adding a forward assist. Soldiers needed the ability to force the rifle into battery, they argued. This seemingly minor change would later become darkly symbolic. Soldiers desperately trying to use the forward assist. Ramming bolts forward on chambers already fouled beyond function. Forcing jammed rifles that should have been cleared. The first M-16s arrived in Vietnam in early 1965. Initial issue went to elite units. Special Forces. Airborne. The 1st Cavalry Division. These early deployments mostly used remaining stocks of IMR 4475 ammunition. These units received better training. Maintained their weapons meticulously. Reports were largely positive. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry carried M-16s into the Ia Drang Valley in November 1965. Moore was West Point, Korean War veteran. He commanded 450 men organized into 4 rifle companies. They deployed aboard 16 UH-1D Huey helicopters, landing in waves at Landing Zone X-ray. The landing zone was a clearing maybe 100 yards wide. Eastern base of the Chu Pong Massif. The mountain rose to 4,400 feet and marked the border with Cambodia. 15 minutes after the first helicopter touched down, Moore's troops made contact. What followed was desperate. 3 days against elements of 3 North Vietnamese regiments. Maybe 2,000 enemy soldiers. The fighting happened at point-blank range. Sometimes hand-to-hand. North Vietnamese forces launched human wave assaults. American soldiers fired their M-16s on full automatic, burning through magazine after magazine. In that first major engagement between American and North Vietnamese regular forces, the M-16 performed remarkably well for most soldiers. The high rate of fire and lightweight ammunition allowed troops to carry significantly more rounds. Moore had ordered his men to carry as much ammunition as possible. Many soldiers carried 300 to 400 rounds. In the desperate close-quarters fighting, this ammunition capacity proved decisive. American firepower combined with artillery and air strikes prevented the North Vietnamese from overrunning the position. Sergeant Ernie Savage, who fought in the battle, remembered it clearly. "I did not run out of ammunition. I had about 30 magazines in my pack and no problems with the M-16. Savage's platoon held a critical position on the perimeter throughout the battle. The M-16s functioned as designed. But Ia Drang represented the best-case scenario. Well-trained soldiers. Elite Airmobile Division. Better instruction on the new rifle. Careful weapons maintenance. Most critically, many of the rifles were still using ammunition loaded with IMR 4475. The propellant the rifle had been designed to use. The weapons were relatively new. Chambers not yet corroded. The chaos and success of the engagement masked warning signs. Problems that would emerge months later when hundreds of thousands of M-16s flooded into Vietnam. Loaded exclusively with WC-846 ammunition. Issued to conventional infantry units with minimal training. The crisis was about to unfold. By mid-1966, the reports started filtering back. The M-16 was failing at catastrophic rates. Soldiers wrote desperate letters home. Officers filed complaints. Medical evacuation helicopters brought back wounded men who reported their rifles had failed at the moment they needed them most. The failures followed a predictable pattern. Deadly and familiar. After firing 10 to 20 rounds, especially in full automatic, The rifle would fail to extract the spent cartridge case. The sequence became grimly routine. Soldier pulls the trigger. Rifle fires. Action cycles. Bolt carrier driven backward by gas pressure. Extractor attempts to pull the spent cartridge case from the chamber. But the case sticks. Gripped by corroded chamber walls. Sealed by powder residue. The extractor, a small hook-shaped piece of spring steel, pulls against the rim of the brass case. The soft brass deforms under pressure. The extractor tears through the rim. Leaves the body of the cartridge wedged firmly in the chamber. The bolt carrier cycles backward, ejecting only the torn brass rim. A fresh round strips from the magazine. Pushed forward by the bolt. But the bolt cannot close. The chamber still contains the body of the previous cartridge case. The fresh round jams against the stuck case. The action is completely locked. Soldier pulls the trigger. Hears only a click. The hammer has fallen on a firing pin that cannot reach the primer because the bolt isn't fully closed. At this point, the rifle is completely inoperable. No amount of manipulation will clear it. The only way to fix this malfunction is to insert a cleaning rod down the barrel from the muzzle end. Punch the stuck case backward out of the chamber. This requires removing the magazine. Locking the bolt to the rear. Inserting a cleaning rod down the 20-inch barrel. Forcefully driving the stuck case out through the ejection port. But soldiers hadn't been issued cleaning rods. The rifle was supposed to be self-cleaning. Cleaning kits, when they existed at all, were kept at base camps. Not carried on patrol. Even if a soldier had a cleaning rod, performing this clearance under fire was virtually impossible. Required both hands. At least 30 seconds, even for an experienced soldier. Left the soldier completely unable to defend himself. In a firefight where the enemy might be 10 feet away in thick jungle, 30 seconds without a functioning weapon was a death sentence. Marine Corporal John Stevens wrote home in June 1966. Out of 40 rounds I fired, my rifle jammed about 10 times. I pack as many grenades as I can, plus bayonet and K-bar jungle knife, so I will have something to fight with. If you can, please send me a bore rod and a 1 1/4 inch paintbrush. I need it. Our rifles are getting a lot of guys killed because they jam so easily. The desperation in that letter. A Marine begging his family to mail him the equipment his own military hadn't provided. Equipment he needed to keep his rifle functioning. Equipment that might keep him alive. Fighting in dense jungle where the enemy could be 5 feet away. Where contact happened without warning. Where survival depended on immediate, overwhelming firepower. And discovering your rifle would fire 5 rounds and then become a useless club. October 1966. The commanding officer of 1st Battalion, 2nd Infantry, 1st Infantry Division filed an official report. The new M-16E1 rifles are experiencing malfunctions to the extent that confidence has been degraded. His battalion had lost men in firefights when their rifles failed. Troops were beginning to pick up enemy AK-47 rifles from dead North Vietnamese soldiers. Weapons they knew would fire reliably even when covered in mud. The AK-47 became the M-16's devastating counterpoint. Designed in the Soviet Union by Mikhail Kalashnikov, adopted in 1947. The AK used a fundamentally different operating system. Long-stroke gas piston. When the rifle fired, propellant gas was tapped from the barrel. But instead of being channeled back into the bolt carrier like the M16, the gas drove a long piston that was physically separate from the bolt carrier. The piston pushed the bolt carrier backward. Then the piston returned forward while the bolt carrier continued cycling. This meant propellant gas and fouling never entered the action. All the combustion residue stayed in the gas tube and piston, completely separate from the bolt and chamber. The AK was also built with loose tolerances. Allowed it to function when dirty, wet, or corroded. The bolt had significant clearance inside the receiver. Dirt and debris simply fell out through gaps in the design. The magazine was curved. Designed to feed reliably even when dented or dirty. Every part of the weapon prioritized reliability over precision. Mikhail Kalashnikov had designed it based on his experience, as a Soviet tank commander in World War II. He knew that soldiers in combat conditions couldn't maintain weapons carefully. He designed a rifle that would work regardless of how badly it was treated. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters maintained their AK-47s poorly, if at all. Weapons were stored in underground caches, exposed to water, mud, humidity for months, carried through rivers, dropped in rice paddies, buried when units retreated. Yet the weapons functioned with near-perfect reliability. An AK could be pulled from a muddy stream, bolt cycled once to clear water from the action, and the weapon would fire. American soldiers noticed immediately. "We found a case that had been buried in mud, dropped in rivers, left in the jungle for weeks," wrote Sergeant William Rodriguez. "We picked them up, pulled the bolt back, and they fired. Our M-16s jammed if you looked at them wrong." The contrast became a bitter joke among infantry units. The enemy had better rifles than we did. The underground market for captured AK-47s flourished. Officially, carrying enemy weapons was prohibited. American ammunition wasn't compatible. Carrying enemy weapons could lead to friendly fire incidents. Unofficially, many squad leaders allowed or even encouraged their men to carry captured AKs. Some soldiers carried both, an M-16 and an AK, using the American rifle until it jammed, then switching to the Soviet weapon. A functioning AK was better than a jammed M-16. Soldiers understood this, even if Army regulations did not. The first official acknowledgement came too slowly. Reports of malfunctions reached General William Westmoreland, commander of Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. Westmoreland found himself in an impossible position. He had personally requested 100,000 M-16s for Vietnam, praised the rifle as ideal for jungle warfare, visited units at Ia Drang shortly after the battle and heard positive reports. He believed the rifle was a significant improvement over the M14. Yet soldiers under his command were writing home that the M16 was getting them killed. The complaints couldn't be ignored. But acknowledging the problem meant admitting a massive failure in weapons procurement. December 1966. The Marine Corps conducted a formal survey of 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines. After a series of engagements where rifle failures had caused casualties, the battalion had been involved in Operation Prairie, heavy fighting in the demilitarized zone near the North Vietnamese border. The survey was devastating. Approximately 80% of troops surveyed reported experiencing stoppages during combat operations. Many reported their rifles jamming after firing fewer than 10 rounds. Several Marines stated they had been wounded or seen fellow Marines killed because rifles failed during contact. Some Marines reported firing only 3 or 4 rounds before experiencing complete weapon failure. The survey documented types of malfunctions. Failure to extract was by far the most common, 80% of all stoppages. Failure to feed accounted for most of the remainder. The extraction failures followed the pattern that had become grimly familiar. But the survey included the most damning evidence yet. One Marine corporal had been killed while running up and down the line of his squad, trying to unjam other Marines' rifles with his cleaning rod. He was the only member of his squad who had managed to obtain a cleaning rod, apparently by trading with another unit. During a firefight, multiple Marines in the squad experienced extraction failures simultaneously. The corporal moved from position to position, using his cleaning rod to punch stock cases out of chambers. While under fire, he was shot and killed while clearing a jam from another Marine's rifle. His own rifle, functioning properly, was found next to his body. He had died trying to keep his squad in the fight. By early 1967, the stories were reaching the American public. Soldiers' letters home began appearing in newspapers. One Marine officer wrote Senator Gaylord Nelson, "The weapon has failed us at crucial moments. As many as 60% of the rifles failed to operate. I know of at least 2 Marines who died within 10 feet of the enemy with jammed rifles." Another letter from a Marine stated simply, "You know what killed most of us? Our own rifles. The M16. Families who had lost sons demanded to know if inadequate equipment had contributed to their deaths. March 26, 1967. The Washington Daily News broke a major story about M-16 reliability problems. Interviews with returning soldiers. Excerpts from letters sent home from Vietnam. The article created a political firestorm. How could American troops be sent into combat with defective rifles? Why had the problems not been identified and corrected before widespread deployment? Who was responsible for decisions that prioritized cost and production speed over soldier safety? The pressure became impossible for Congress to ignore. May 3, 1967. Representative L. Mendel Rivers, chairman of the House Committee on Armed Services, established a special subcommittee to investigate the M-16 rifle program. Congressman Richard Ichord, Democrat of Missouri, was appointed chairman. The Ichord Committee, as it became known, would conduct the most thorough investigation of a weapons procurement program in congressional history. Over the next 5 months, the committee held hearings. May 15th, 16th, 31st. June 21st. July 25th, 26th, 27th. August 8th, 9th, 22nd. All hearings conducted at the Rayburn House Office Building in Washington. The committee interviewed hundreds of witnesses. Combat soldiers recently returned from Vietnam. Army generals. Colt engineers. Ammunition manufacturers. Eugene Stoner himself. Pentagon procurement officials. Testimony was given under oath. Documents were subpoenaed. Technical experts explained the ballistics and engineering involved. The committee examined every aspect of the M-16 program. Reviewed procurement decisions going back to 1963. Analyzed test reports that had been filed and ignored. They studied engineering drawings. Manufacturing specifications. They interviewed soldiers who had survived firefights where their rifles failed. They brought in weapons recovered from casualties. Rifles found next to dead Americans with stuck cases still in the chambers. The picture that emerged was devastating. Every decision that had transformed the reliable AR-15 into the failing M-16 was documented in detail. The switch from IMAR 4475 to WC-846 powder without adequate testing. The rejection of chrome plating despite manufacturer recommendations. The failure to provide cleaning equipment or training. The misleading claims about the rifle being self-cleaning. The increased cyclic rate that accelerated fouling. Quality control problems at Colt that allowed rifles to be shipped with defective parts. Each failure documented with technical data. Engineering reports. The testimony of soldiers who had paid the price. The committee discovered that multiple people had raised red flags about these issues before widespread deployment. Colt engineers had protested the ammunition change in writing. Company officials had stated explicitly they could not guarantee weapon performance with the new powder. Eugene Stoner had recommended chrome plating in his original design specifications. Air Force officers who had used the rifle successfully emphasized the need for cleaning equipment and training. Test reports had shown increased malfunction rates with WC-846 ammunition. All of these warnings had been ignored. Dismissed. Buried in the urgency to get rifles to Vietnam and the desire to cut costs. The most damning revelation concerned who knew what and when. Army Ordnance had test data showing WC-846 ammunition caused increased malfunction rates. They had reports from Colt stating the company could not guarantee rifle performance with WC-846. They knew rifles without chrome plating corroded in humid environments. They knew soldiers weren't receiving adequate training or cleaning equipment. Yet deployment had continued, month after month, while soldiers died because their rifles failed. The testimony of returned combat veterans proved particularly powerful. Marine Corporal Thomas Martinez testified about a firefight where his rifle jammed after the third round. He described using his jammed rifle as a club, suffering a bayonet wound, watching his fire team leader die while trying to clear his own jammed rifle. Private First Class David Chen described finding a dead American patrol. All 7 men killed. All 7 M-16s jammed. Cleaning rods scattered around the bodies where the men had died trying to clear their weapons. Eugene Stoner explained his design philosophy for the committee. The AR-15 was engineered as a complete weapons system. The rifle, the ammunition, the maintenance procedures, all worked together. Changing the ammunition without extensive testing broke the system. He had recommended chrome plating specifically because he knew the direct gas impingement system would be vulnerable to corrosion without it. He had never claimed the rifle was self-cleaning. That characterization had been invented by marketing departments, repeated by people who didn't understand the weapon. Ballistics experts testified about the differences between IMR 4475 and WC 846. The ball powder produced higher port pressures, increased the volume of gas and residue blown into the action. The calcium carbonate in WC 846 created fouling that IMR 4475 did not. The increased cyclic rate meant more rounds fired before a soldier could react to a malfunction, leading to worse jams. All of this had been predictable. Some of it had been predicted. The predictions had been ignored. Representatives from Colt testified that they had raised concerns about the ammunition change. They stated in writing they could not guarantee rifle performance with WC 846, that the increased cyclic rate violated Army acceptance standards. The Army had granted waivers allowing the higher cyclic rate. Quality control inspectors testified about finding defects in rifles being shipped to Vietnam. Bolt carriers with improper hardness that would crack under stress. Extractors with weak springs that would fail to pull stuck cases. They had rejected these rifles. The rejections had been overruled in the urgency to meet production quotas. The financial testimony exposed another dimension of the scandal. The decision to use WC 846 had saved money. Ball powder was cheaper and faster to produce than stick powder. Olin Matheson had made substantial profits from ammunition contracts. The decision not to chromeplate chambers had saved production costs. While the committee found no evidence of outright corruption or bribery, the cozy relationships between military procurement officers and defense contractors had clearly affected decision-making. Cost considerations and production convenience had outweighed combat effectiveness and soldier safety. By August 1967, the Ichord Committee had assembled an overwhelming case. The M-16 failures were not the result of soldier incompetence or inadequate training alone. They were the result of systematic failures in weapons procurement, testing, and deployment. Multiple officials and organizations shared responsibility. Army Ordnance had approved the ammunition change without adequate testing. The Army Material Command had rejected manufacturer recommendations about chrome plating. Training commands had failed to develop proper maintenance instruction. Colt had continued production despite knowing about problems. Olin Matheson had supplied ammunition that didn't work properly with the rifle. Pentagon procurement officials had prioritized cost and speed over reliability. The committee's formal report, released on October 19, 1967, contained extensive findings and recommendations. The switch to ball powder ammunition was identified as the primary cause of malfunctions. The lack of chrome plating in the chamber was the secondary cause. The failure to provide adequate cleaning equipment and training was the tertiary cause. The report recommended immediate action. Chromeplate all M-16 chambers and bores. Develop improved ammunition with reduced fouling characteristics. Provide extensive cleaning kits to all troops carrying M-16s. Implement comprehensive training programs on proper maintenance. Modify the rifle to reduce the cyclic rate. Establish better quality control in production. Create accountability for procurement decisions that affected soldier safety. The investigation generated enough political pressure that the Army could not continue its previous course. Changes began immediately. Even before the final report was released. The Army had already been standardizing the improved XM16E1 as the M16A1. Type classified February 13, 1967. Officially adopted February 20, 1967. Production of the improved rifle ramped up rapidly through spring and summer. The M16A1 incorporated critical modifications that addressed every major failure point. The chamber and bore were chrome-plated, eliminating the corrosion problems that caused cases to stick. The chrome plating process added manufacturing steps, but proved essential. Each chamber was carefully prepared, cleaned, then electroplated with a thin layer of hard chromium. The chrome created a smooth, corrosion-resistant surface. Spent cartridge cases no longer stuck in corroded chambers. Extraction failures dropped dramatically. A new buffer assembly reduced the cyclic rate back toward original specifications. The buffer consisted of weights and springs inside the buttstock that absorbed the impact of the bolt carrier at the end of its rearward travel. The redesigned buffer used heavier weights and stiffer springs to slow the action cycling. This reduced the cyclic rate from over 900 rounds per minute back down to between 750 and 850. The slower cyclic rate meant less violent action cycling, reduced stress on all components. The forward assist was strengthened and improved. While Eugene Stoner had opposed this feature, soldiers in the field found it useful when properly applied. However, training emphasized that the forward assist was for chambering a round when loading the rifle quietly, not for forcing a jammed action. Most importantly, the designation change came with a complete overhaul of training and maintenance procedures. The self-cleaning myth was explicitly and publicly debunked. Army training commands rewrote all instruction materials. The new doctrine emphasized that the M-16 required regular, thorough cleaning, especially in combat conditions. Field Manual 23-9 was completely rewritten. Detailed cleaning instructions, step-by-step procedures with photographs and diagrams. It specified exactly how to disassemble the rifle, what to clean, how to clean it, how often. Soldiers were instructed to clean the chamber and bore after every firing session. The gas tube required cleaning weekly in combat conditions. The bolt and bolt carrier needed to be disassembled, cleaned, and lubricated daily when in the field. Comic book-style manuals were produced. Simple illustrations, step-by-step procedures, could be understood even by troops with limited literacy or for whom English wasn't their primary language. The comic format used clear drawings showing each step. Arrows indicated direction of movement. Text was minimal and simple. A soldier who couldn't read technical prose could follow the illustrated guide. Comprehensive cleaning kits were manufactured and distributed throughout Vietnam. Each kit contained everything needed to maintain the rifle in combat conditions. 3-piece aluminum cleaning rod that could be screwed together to reach the full length of the barrel. Bore brush with stiff bronze bristles to scrub fouling from the rifling. Chamber brush specifically designed to clean the chamber walls where cases stuck. Pipe cleaners to clean the gas tube without disassembling the rifle. Cotton patches to wipe surfaces clean. Small bottle of lubricating oil. Toothbrush-style brush for cleaning the bolt and bolt carrier. The entire kit fit in a small plastic case that could be carried in a cargo pocket or attached to load-bearing equipment. Soldiers were required to clean their rifles daily in combat conditions, more often if they had fired extensively. Squad leaders inspected weapons regularly. Platoon sergeants conducted detailed inspections before and after operations. A dirty rifle was treated as a serious offense, equivalent to other failures of discipline. The message was clear. Your rifle will work if you maintain it. It will fail if you neglect it. New training programs emphasized that the M-16 required regular maintenance just like any other mechanical device. The self-cleaning myth was explicitly debunked in training classes. Drill instructors taught proper cleaning procedures, inspected rifles rigorously. Recruits spent hours learning to disassemble, clean, and reassemble their rifles, until they could perform the procedure quickly and correctly, even in darkness. Before deploying to Vietnam, soldiers received additional training specifically on maintaining weapons in tropical conditions. Most critically, the ammunition itself was improved. In 1970, a new powder designated WC-844 replaced WC-846 for 5.56 mm ammunition. WC-844 had reduced calcium carbonate content, producing significantly less fouling. The combination of chrome plating and cleaner ammunition solved the extraction problem that had killed so many soldiers. The results were dramatic. By late 1967 and early 1968, units equipped with M16A1s, proper cleaning equipment, and adequate training reported substantial improvements in reliability. Malfunction rates dropped to levels comparable to or better than other military rifles. The extraction failures that had plagued the original M16 became rare. Soldiers who had despised and feared the M16 began to trust it. The rifle's inherent advantages could finally be realized without the crippling reliability problems. The lightweight meant soldiers could carry more ammunition or reduce the burden of their combat load. The high-capacity 30-round magazine gave sustained firepower in contact. The controllability in full automatic fire allowed accurate suppressive fire. The devastating terminal ballistics of the high-velocity 5.56mm round at close range proved highly effective in jungle combat. With chrome-plated chambers, proper cleaning, and improved ammunition, the M16A1 became the weapon it should have been from the beginning. In early 1968, the Army conducted comprehensive surveys of troops in Vietnam, designed to measure soldier confidence in the improved rifle, identify any remaining problems. Results showed overwhelming satisfaction. Approval ranged from 85% to 98% across different surveys. The February 1968 Department of Defense survey provided the most detailed data. 2,100 soldiers and Marines were surveyed about their combat experience with the M16A1. Only 38 individuals, less than 2%, stated they wanted to replace the M16 with a different weapon. The vast majority reported the rifle functioned reliably in combat. Most soldiers reported no significant malfunctions during the previous month of operations. When malfunctions did occur, they were typically minor feeding issues that could be cleared quickly. Not the catastrophic extraction failures that had killed men a year earlier. An August to September 1967 survey, conducted while improvements were being implemented, found that 85% of respondents reported the M16 performed well in combat. 87% said they liked the weapon. A January to February 1968 survey found that 85% of troops wanted either the M16 or the XM177, a carbine version of the M16, for combat operations. The remaining 15% preferred other weapons. But this was considered normal variation. No weapon satisfies all users under all conditions. The transformation was complete. A weapon that had been called a death trap, that soldiers had refused to carry, that men had died cursing, had become trusted and effective. The same basic design, when properly implemented with appropriate ammunition, chrome plating, cleaning equipment, and training, proved to be an excellent combat rifle. The human cost of the delay was incalculable. No one knows exactly how many American soldiers died because their M16s jammed during firefights. The number was certainly in the hundreds. Possibly more. Each death was preventable. Each resulted from decisions made in offices thousands of miles from Vietnam. Decisions that prioritized production speed and cost savings over soldier survival. Beyond deaths, thousands of soldiers had been wounded while fighting with jammed rifles or using inferior weapons. The psychological cost was equally severe. Soldiers lost faith not just in their rifles, but in the institution that had sent them into combat with defective equipment. The damage extended beyond individual tragedies. The M16 scandal became a symbol of everything wrong with the Vietnam War. Hasty decisions, inadequate testing, prioritization of systems and statistics over human realities, disconnect between leadership and troops in the field. For many Americans, the story of soldiers dying with jammed rifles epitomized the war's larger failures. The story didn't end in 1967. The M16A1 served throughout the remainder of the Vietnam War with increasing success. As soldiers learned proper maintenance, and the weapon's quirks became familiar, the rifle evolved from liability to legend. By the 1970s, veterans who had cursed the early M16s praised the M16A1. The rifle continued to evolve. Through the M16A2, A3, A4, and eventually the M4 carbine. Serving American forces for over 50 years. Equipping armies around the world. The transformation happened because the problems were identified, investigated publicly, and corrected systematically. The legacy of the M-16 crisis shaped military procurement for decades. The Ichord Committee's investigation established precedents for congressional oversight of weapons programs that continue today. Before the M-16 scandal, weapons procurement had been largely an internal military matter. Congress appropriated funds but rarely questioned technical decisions about weapons design, testing, or deployment. The military and defense contractors operated with minimal outside scrutiny. The Ichord investigation changed this fundamentally. The concept of soldier feedback became institutionalized. Before Vietnam, weapons were tested by ordnance experts and evaluated by technical specialists. The opinions of ordinary soldiers who would actually carry the weapons into combat were rarely solicited, often dismissed when offered. The M-16 crisis demonstrated that soldiers in combat conditions discovered problems that laboratory testing missed. Their feedback wasn't merely anecdotal complaint. It was essential operational data. The Army established formal mechanisms for troops to report equipment problems. After the war, the Army created the Product Quality Deficiency Report System, allowing soldiers to file official reports about equipment failures. These reports were tracked, investigated, could trigger engineering changes or procurement modifications. Similar systems were established for all services. The voice of the soldier in the field gained authority it had never possessed before. Operational testing in combat conditions became mandatory before full-scale deployment of new weapons. The practice of adopting a weapon based solely on laboratory testing and limited field trials ended. New rifles, machine guns, and other individual weapons now undergo extensive operational testing by combat units in realistic conditions. Test units file detailed reports on reliability, maintainability, and combat effectiveness. Procurement decisions cannot proceed without positive operational test results. Procurement regulations were tightened to prevent the kinds of waivers and shortcuts that had caused the M-16 disaster. The practice of granting waivers that allowed weapons to be fielded despite failing to meet specifications came under intense scrutiny. New regulations required that any waiver to acceptance standards be documented, justified in writing, approved at high levels of authority. The casual granting of waivers that had allowed defective M-16s to be shipped to Vietnam became much more difficult. Quality control inspections became more rigorous and independent. Previously, contractors often performed their own quality control with minimal oversight. After the M-16 scandal, government inspectors gained more authority to reject defective weapons, even if contractors accepted them. The practice of overruling inspector rejections to meet production quotas was forbidden by new regulations. Manufacturing defects had to be corrected, not ignored. Most importantly, the fundamental lesson was learned. A weapon system must be tested as a complete system. Changing one component affects the entire system. Cost savings that compromise reliability are not savings at all when measured in lives lost. Contractor recommendations about their own products should be heeded, not dismissed for convenience. Soldiers' complaints from the field should be investigated immediately, not buried in bureaucracy. 1985. 20 years after Ia Drang. Veterans of the 1st Cavalry Division held a reunion in Texas. Many brought their families to show them where their service had begun. Among the attendees were men who had fought with the original M-16s at Ia Drang, and men who had struggled with jammed rifles in later battles. Former Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, who had carried an M-16 through 13 months in Vietnam from 1967 to 68, spoke about the experience. The early M-16 was a death trap. We knew it. We reported it. Nothing happened for a year. Men died while bureaucrats argued about powder specifications and chrome plating costs. He paused. But the M16A1, once they fixed it, that was a different weapon. Best rifle I ever carried. Light, accurate, reliable when you maintained it. It was what the original should have been. The lessons learned shaped not just rifles, but the entire military procurement system. Independent testing by soldiers in realistic conditions became standard. Congressional oversight of major weapons programs became routine. Contractor claims were verified rather than accepted. Today, the M-16 is gradually being replaced by newer rifles. But the M-16 family will remain in service for years. The rifle that nearly became America's worst procurement disaster instead became its most successful. Precisely because the disaster was investigated, publicized, and corrected. The M-16 crisis demonstrated several truths about military procurement and warfare. There are no shortcuts to reliability. Soldier feedback must be acted upon immediately. Transparency and accountability drive improvement. Good design can be ruined by bad implementation. Problems can be fixed if there is will to fix them. The soldiers who died because their M16s jammed in combat deserve better. They deserved rifles that had been properly tested. They deserved ammunition that worked with their weapons. They deserved chrome-plated chambers that wouldn't corrode. They deserved cleaning equipment and training. They deserved leaders who would listen to their complaints and act immediately. The fact that later soldiers received all these things doesn't diminish the tragedy of those who died before the fixes were implemented. The M16 story became one of redemption because the rifle that soldiers called a death trap in 1966 became the rifle they praised in 1970 and beyond. The weapon that symbolized Pentagon incompetence became proof that accountability and transparency could force improvement. But redemption never erases the original sin. The men who died with jammed M16s bought that redemption with their lives. The congressional investigation, the media exposure, the public outrage. These forces drove change. They transformed a failing rifle into a reliable weapon. They reformed procurement procedures. They established accountability for equipment decisions. When soldiers were dying with jammed rifles and the military bureaucracy was slow to respond, it took Congress and the press to force action. The Ichord Committee's investigation saved American lives by exposing the truth and demanding fixes. Today's soldiers carry weapons that work because soldiers in Vietnam carried weapons that failed. And because those failures were investigated publicly and corrected systematically. The M16 succeeded in the long run not because it was perfectly designed, but because when it failed, the failure was not covered up or ignored. The rifle jammed. Soldiers died. The news got out. Congress investigated. Changes were made. The rifle worked. The men who carried M16s in Vietnam, particularly those who served in 1966 and 67 when the problems were worst, deserve recognition not just for their combat service, but for their persistence with defective equipment. They fought the enemy with rifles that too often wouldn't fire. They improvised using grenades and captured weapons and sheer determination. They reported problems up the chain of command. They wrote letters home describing the failures. Their complaints eventually triggered the investigation that fixed the system. The M16 failed American soldiers in Vietnam. Then America fixed the M16. That sequence of failure and correction defines both the tragedy and the triumph of the story. The tragedy was preventable. The triumph was earned. Together they taught lessons that shaped American military procurement for generations. Lessons written not in ink, but in blood. In the jungles of Vietnam, where the morning air hung thick over landing zone X-ray, and First Lieutenant James Riley's hands finally stopped shaking. Where the rifle in his hands had saved his life. While 3 men beside him lay dead. Their rifles silent.